What would you do if your own HOA board member kept sneaking into your driveway at night, stealing electricity to charge her Tesla, and laughed in your face when you asked her to stop? Imagine paying thousands of dollars to upgrade your home, believing you were finally ahead of the curve, only to realize someone else was quietly reaping the benefits. That was exactly what happened to Darius Coleman, a 42-year-old engineer living just outside Round Rock, Texas. He had poured his savings into installing a brand new solar panel system on his home, convinced it was one of the smartest decisions he'd ever made. Clean energy, lower bills, and a sense of independence. That was the dream. But within weeks, he noticed something strange. His electric bills weren't shrinking the way they should. At first, he chalked it up to the unpredictable Texas summer heat. Air conditioners across the neighborhood were working overtime, and maybe his household usage was higher than he thought. But then, late at night, he would glance at the monitoring app tied to his panels and see irregular spikes in power draw. Not once or twice, but regularly. Always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Darius was methodical by nature. Numbers had to make sense, and these numbers didn't. He sat in his garage one evening, laptop perched on the hood of his old Ford pickup, scrolling through the data logs. The readings suggested that someone was pulling enough power to run more than just a lamp or a fan. It looked like something big was charging consistently. The thought gnawed at him. He knew his wife and kids weren't secretly plugging in some hidden device. There had to be another explanation. The answer came from a simple decision. He turned to the security cameras he'd mounted around his home. Darius had set them up himself, complete with infrared night vision. They rarely caught more than a stray cat or a delivery driver. But this time was different. On a Tuesday night, just after 1 a.m., the footage showed a figure walking briskly up his driveway. The person moved with an air of entitlement, not sneaking, not cautious, just bold. She wheeled a charging cable across the side yard and, without hesitation, plugged it into the external outlet connected to his solar grid. Standing under the pale glow of the porch light was Linda Markham, his HOA board member, a woman known around the neighborhood for her sharp tongue and constant lectures about everyone else's landscaping. But here she was in his driveway, feeding her glossy Tesla with his electricity. Darius couldn't believe it. He replayed the video 3 times, each loop confirming the same thing. Linda didn't look rushed. She didn't look worried about being caught. She simply leaned against the car, scrolling her phone as if she owned the place. After 20 minutes, she unplugged, coiled the cable neatly, and walked away as if nothing unusual had happened. The realization left Darius stunned. He thought about how much energy her car must have drawn, and how that explained the strange spikes in his data logs. The theft wasn't just small, it was deliberate, and she had probably been doing it for weeks. The next morning, while sipping coffee at his kitchen table, he felt a storm of emotions. Part of him laughed at the absurdity. Another part of him felt insulted, almost violated. His property, his investment, was being taken advantage of in plain sight. But Darius wasn't quick to anger. Years of working in engineering had taught him to keep a level head and solve problems logically. He needed to decide what to do. He considered his options. He could knock on her door right away and confront her. He could file a police report. He could blast the video on the neighborhood group chat. Each choice carried its own risks, especially since Linda wasn't just any neighbor. She sat on the HOA board, wielding influence in ways that could make life very complicated. That night, though, as he sat in his darkened living room watching the camera feed live on his phone, he couldn't shake the sense of disbelief. The footage replayed in his head over and over. The morning after confirming what he saw on camera, Darius couldn't concentrate at work. He logged into his job from home, spreadsheets glowing across his dual monitors, but his mind kept drifting back to that video. Every time he tried to crunch numbers, Linda's face popped up in his head, leaning casually against her Tesla while it sucked power straight from his solar panels. He told himself to focus. After all, he was a professional problem solver. But this was personal. And the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. How long had she been doing this? How much money had it already cost him? And why on earth did she think it was okay? Later that evening, after dinner with his wife Angela and their 2 kids, he decided to check the footage from previous nights. The archive stretched back weeks. Sitting at the dining table with headphones in, He scrolled through motion-activated clips. And there she was, over and over again. Sometimes it was quick, 15 minutes of charging. Other nights she lingered for nearly an hour, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always with the same nonchalant attitude. Angela noticed the grim look on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You don't want to know," he muttered, eyes still locked on the screen. "Try me." He sighed, paused the video, and turned the laptop toward her. "That's Linda. She's been plugging her car into our outlet at night." "Probably for weeks." Angela's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "She's stealing from us. That's insane." "Yeah," Darius said. "And she doesn't even try to hide it." Angela shook her head. "You need to say something. Right away. This isn't just rude, it's theft." Darius nodded, but he wasn't sure yet. His nature wasn't confrontational. He liked to weigh things before acting, to be certain about his next step. So instead of marching to Linda's door that night, he started keeping a record, each incident logged with timestamps, screenshots, and clips. If she thought he wasn't paying attention, she was wrong. Still, watching the pattern form made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the money, though it mattered. It was the sheer arrogance. Linda was one of those neighbors who always had something to say about everyone else's property. If someone's grass grew a little too high, she sent a notice. If someone parked their car slightly crooked, she posted about it in the HOA group. And yet here she was, stealing power like it was her right. Days passed. Darius kept documenting. He watched as Linda came and went, smug and careless. Finally, one evening, he decided enough was enough. He waited until the kids were asleep, until Angela had retreated to the bedroom with a book. Then he slipped outside, phone in hand, and walked to Linda's house. The porch light was on, and her Tesla sat gleaming in the driveway. He knocked. Footsteps approached. The door swung open. Linda stood there, arms crossed, her expression sharp and impatient. "Darius, what do you want?" He held up his phone, showing her the paused frame of the security footage. "You know what this is?" Her eyes flicked down. For a moment, he thought he saw a flash of guilt, but then she laughed. Actually laughed right in his face. "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little electricity." Darius felt his jaw tighten. "It's theft, Linda. You've been stealing from me. Night after night." She rolled her eyes. "Stealing? Really? You've got more than enough power with those fancy solar panels. What's the harm?" "The harm," Darius said evenly, "is that it's my property. My investment. You don't get to help yourself." But Linda only leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Listen, you can make this into a big deal if you want. But I'm on the HOA board. You really want to pick a fight with me? Think about it. Code violations, fines, notices. Do you really want that kind of trouble?" Darius's stomach sank, but he kept his eyes steady. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm saying," Linda replied, her smile tightening into something colder, "that maybe you should just let this go. Otherwise, I'll make sure your life in this neighborhood gets very, very difficult." Darius stood there, silence stretching between them. For a moment, he considered backing down. But then he remembered the weeks of footage, the smug look on her face under his porch light, the way she acted as if the rules didn't apply to her. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and leaned in just enough to make his voice carry. "Do what you want, Linda, but I promise you this isn't over." And as he turned and walked back across the lawn, he didn't see the flicker of unease in her eyes, the way her smirk faltered for the first time. Darius didn't sleep well after that confrontation, his mind playing the scene on a loop. The smug way Linda leaned against her doorframe, the casual threat behind her words, the gall of laughing when caught red-handed. And as he lay in the dark listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, he realized that in her eyes this wasn't theft. It was entitlement, an abuse of power she was so comfortable with that she thought herself untouchable. And that knowledge lit a quiet fury in him that refused to be extinguished. The next morning he woke to find an envelope taped to his mailbox with the HOA seal stamped in cheap ink, and inside was a notice citing him for improper placement of refuse bins and excessive shrub growth on the north side of his yard. Complaints that were both laughable and infuriating because his trash cans had been lined up in the same discreet corner for years, and his hedges were trimmed neatly just 2 weeks prior, Yet here it was in writing, a petty strike only hours after he had dared to confront her. Proof that Linda was not bluffing. Proof that she would weaponize every ounce of her influence on the board to make his life a maze of fines and threats. He brought the notice inside, laying it on the kitchen table where Angela studied it with a frown. "She's retaliating," she whispered, and he nodded grimly. "She wants me to fold. She wants me to shut up, but I'm not giving her the satisfaction." And that night he began setting traps. Not physical yet, not electrical yet, but meticulous layers of evidence. Cameras repositioned for better angles, timestamps synchronized, his solar monitoring app set to issue real-time alerts whenever an irregular spike occurred, and he even bought a small drone he could fly discreetly from the backyard to capture overhead footage if she tried anything from a different angle. Because if Linda wanted to play dirty, he would build a case so airtight that no smirk or HOA rulebook could save her. Still, the pressure mounted as within a week he received 2 more notices, one for unauthorized exterior lighting because of the motion-sensing LEDs he had installed near the garage, and another absurd citation for non-compliant vehicle storage, because his old Ford pickup, the one he used mainly on weekends, had been parked in the driveway for more than 72 hours, both fines signed at the bottom by Linda's looping handwriting, and each one made Angela more anxious. The kids overhearing enough whispers to ask nervously if they might have to move. And that thought enraged Darius further because this wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about dominance, control, and the ability of one arrogant woman to twist a community into her personal playground. He could have gone to the police, but every neighbor knew the small-town deputies had little appetite for HOA disputes, and Linda would only spin the story into something trivial. So he decided instead to keep his cool, pay nothing, document everything, and wait for the moment when she slipped far enough that even her position couldn't protect her. The breaking point came late one Friday night when Darius, watching the live feed in the glow of his phone, saw Linda once again pulling her Tesla cable across his driveway, utterly fearless, humming to herself as if it were her own property, and he realized she hadn't slowed down at all after the confrontation. In fact, she had become bolder, more deliberate, as though daring him to react. And in that instant, the engineer inside him began sketching a plan, one that would take her arrogance and turn it into her undoing, not by violence, not by rash outburst, but through calculation and a little manipulation of the very electricity she was so eager to steal. For the next week, he worked after hours in the garage, soldering boards, rerouting circuits, building what he jokingly thought of as the bite, a system that would allow him with a flick of his phone to spike the outlet Linda kept exploiting, not enough to kill, never enough to maim, but enough to send a violent crack of sparks and heat that would scare the entitlement out of anyone foolish enough to think his property was free for the taking. And as he worked, he felt a grim satisfaction grow inside him, a sense of control returning even while new HOA notices piled up in his mailbox. Because this wasn't just defense anymore, it was counterattack. It was preparing the battlefield. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the neighbors. Quiet remarks at mailboxes or over hedges, some sympathetic, some hesitant. Many, too, afraid to side openly against Linda, but quick to hint that she had stepped on toes before, that she had been caught sneaking onto another neighbor's yard to measure grass height with a ruler, that she had berated a single mother for leaving toys on her porch. And all of it painted a portrait of a tyrant whose power rested not on respect, but on fear. And Darius realized he wasn't alone. Others hated her too. They just hadn't dared to resist. Then came the night he tested his device, hiding in the shadows of his garage as Linda appeared like clockwork at 1:17 a.m., her Tesla sliding silently into place, the charging cable slithering across his driveway once more. And when she plugged in with her usual smug indifference, Darius let her sit for 5 minutes before he thumbed the switch on his phone. A quiet command sent through a relay, and suddenly a sharp crack split the night. A shower of sparks spitting from the outlet, Linda yelping and stumbling backward as her phone clattered to the ground, the Tesla's lights flickering angrily before the connection died. Darius stayed hidden, heart pounding, watching as she snatched up her phone, her face flushed with both shock and fury, and though she looked around suspiciously, she had no proof, No camera pointing back at her. Nothing but the knowledge that something had gone wrong with her little scheme. And after a minute of angry muttering, she unplugged and stomped away into the dark, dragging the cable like a defeated soldier retreating from battle. But Darius knew this wasn't the end. Her pride wouldn't let her walk away, and sure enough, 2 days later, a thick certified letter arrived accusing him of hazardous electrical modifications and demanding an inspection of his property within 48 hours, signed once again by Linda. And as Darius read it on his porch, jaw tight, he realized she had sensed his resistance and was striking harder, escalating the war into official territory, using the HOA's full weight to crush him. Angela pleaded with him to be careful. The kids picked up on the tension, but Darius only grew colder, calmer, because the game had shifted now. And if Linda wanted war, then war she would have. Yet deep down, he also knew that this tit-for-tat couldn't continue forever. That one of them would have to break, and in his gut he resolved it would not be him. So when the inspector arrived, a mild-mannered man with a clipboard and apologetic eyes, Darius was ready, his garage spotless, his wiring impeccable, every code met to the letter. And though the inspector noted nothing amiss, Linda appeared in the background, arms crossed, glaring from her driveway like a queen denied tribute. And it was in that moment Darius understood the full scope of her obsession. Because she wasn't just angry about losing stolen electricity. She was furious that he had dared to defy her. And that meant the next move she made would be more dangerous, more desperate. And as he closed the door behind the inspector and sat in his darkened living room again, the blue glow of his laptop illuminating his determined face, he whispered to himself, "You want to fight, Linda? You've got one." Even as outside in the shadows of the neighborhood, her Tesla purred ominously, ready for another attempt, ready for another clash that would decide not just who controlled the electricity, but who controlled the entire neighborhood. And as midnight crept closer, Darius's phone buzzed with another alert, an irregular spike of power draw, and he smiled grimly. Because this time, when Linda reached for his outlet, she had no idea he had armed something far more elaborate than a spark trap, and the night was about to erupt in a way that neither of them could predict. The tension in Oak Ridge Heights thickened like storm clouds gathering over a valley, and Darius knew the uneasy quiet following his last face-to-face with Linda was nothing more than the calm before an eruption. The neighborhood, once bland and silent except for lawnmowers and the occasional children's laughter, had transformed into a chessboard of quiet stares, whispered gossip, and the subtle shifting of alliances. Every walk past his driveway was slower. Every head turned his way, every passing vehicle seemed to pause just a little too long before moving on. Linda had begun her smear campaign in earnest. And the HOA newsletters that once spoke of garage sales and landscaping tips now carried veiled warnings about residents who disrupt harmony, rogue power usage, and those exploiting loopholes to avoid community contribution. Everyone knew it was aimed at him, though his name was never written. What unnerved him most wasn't the slander, but how quickly people began to believe it. Neighbors who once nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid him, and children were pulled closer to their parents' sides when he passed. Still, Darius carried himself with quiet defiance, knowing that silence was his strength, that exposing Linda's lies and tricks in the right moment would crush her. Yet silence also gnawed at him, for each day the harassment escalated. His property tax bill arrived with adjusted fees mysteriously tacked on. His trash collection was suddenly suspended due to non-compliance, and letters appeared taped to his door warning him of impending fines for imaginary violations. He knew Linda's hand was in all of it. She wielded the HOA like a weapon, manipulating rules into blades. But she wanted more than fines. More than humiliation, she wanted him broken, desperate, out of Oak Ridge Heights. What she hadn't counted on was that Darius was an engineer, a man who had spent his life solving problems others thought unsolvable. He had already begun quietly hardening his property. The solar system she mocked as a toy now functioned as a power fortress. He'd rerouted his wiring, installed battery backups, and designed his own improvised voltage control mechanisms. He installed discrete cameras in the eaves of his home and camouflaged motion sensors along his driveway. The system wasn't just security, it was a warning web. Every flicker of movement near his property pinged his phone. He wasn't simply defending his home. He was preparing for war, though he loathed admitting that word even to himself. Yet war was what Linda had already declared in her own way. HOA meetings became tribunals where his name was spat like a curse, and neighbors raised their hands to vote on measures crafted solely to suffocate him financially. Linda presided over them like a monarch, her voice smooth, her smile sharp, rallying fear and envy into unified hostility. "Do you want this community to fall apart because one man thinks he's above the rules?" she'd ask, and they murmured their agreement like sheep nodding to their shepherd. Darius, once invisible, was now painted as the villain haunting their cul-de-sac. One night, as he sat reviewing a blueprint of his wiring adjustments, his sensors alerted him. He switched to the live feed and saw a cluster of shadows at the edge of his yard. They weren't kids playing or delivery workers. They were grown men, faces hidden under caps, standing unnervingly still. One of them approached his charging station, the very one Linda had once exploited, and bent low as if inspecting it. Darius felt heat surge in his chest. Linda wasn't content with fines and whispers. She was probing his defenses, sending scouts to test his resolve. He considered rushing outside, but something made him hold back. Instead, he watched, recording every second, noting how they examined his system, how one of them tugged at a cable before the others motioned him back. They didn't speak aloud, but the intent was clear. They were planning something. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by his window in the dark, eyes fixed on his yard, adrenaline pumping with each rustle of leaves. The battle had escalated, and the line between property dispute and open hostility had been crossed. The next day, Linda called an emergency HOA session, and though Darius didn't attend, he already knew the outcome before the minutes were even published. They voted to strip him of community privileges, including access to amenities he never used, but symbolically it was exile. Worse, they filed a petition with the county to investigate his solar grid for unlicensed commercial energy distribution. Darius laughed bitterly when he read the notice. Linda was twisting his self-sufficiency into criminality, accusing him of running an illegal power company out of his home. It would tie him up in hearings, legal fees, and inspections, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. Yet even as he braced for that battle, he knew the real danger wasn't the paperwork. The real danger was the people Linda was riling up, neighbors who now looked at him as a parasite, a cheat, a threat. He saw them muttering at the mailbox, arms crossed, glancing toward his house like it was a contamination in their perfect neighborhood. Linda was building an army, and the HOA was her weapon. Darius decided he wouldn't wait to be cornered. He began reinforcing not only his grid but his home. He quietly upgraded his breaker box with a system that could surge block intruders, reconfigured his lights to flicker in defensive patterns, and installed steel reinforcements behind his doors. To the casual eye, his house remained an ordinary suburban home, but beneath it hummed the quiet preparation of a fortress. He tested his circuits late at night, running simulations of what would happen if Linda or her pawns attempted to siphon his power again. Each time the system responded flawlessly, cutting the intrusion and sending a surge back through the line. He knew one day they'd try again, and when they did, the shock would be more than metaphorical. It was then that the county inspector arrived, accompanied by 2 deputies. Darius greeted them politely, knowing Linda's fingerprints were all over this visit. The inspector walked through his home, checked his panels, scribbled notes, and finally admitted with thinly veiled frustration that everything was by the book. Darius smiled as the deputies exchanged glances. They expected a criminal but found only compliance and precision. Linda had lost this round, but he knew her well enough by now to understand she wouldn't stop. In fact, failure would only make her more vicious. That evening, the sensors triggered again, but this time it wasn't a few shadows lingering at the edges. It was a group, larger, bolder, marching right up his driveway under cover of night. Darius pulled up the live feed and counted at least 8 of them, men and women, neighbors he recognized, their faces twisted in anger. And leading them was Linda herself, her blonde hair catching the faint glow of the street lamp, her expression carved in triumph. They carried tools, flashlights, even a bolt cutter. His heart pounded as he realized this wasn't reconnaissance or intimidation. This was an invasion. They were coming to his property en masse, ready to tear down, seize, or sabotage what they couldn't control. The HOA wasn't just finding him anymore. They were storming his home. Darius rose from his chair, every muscle taut, adrenaline flooding his veins. The fortress was ready, his defenses armed, and his will unbroken. He whispered to himself, steady and low, "All right, Linda, you wanted a war. You've got one." And as the mob's footsteps crunched onto his gravel driveway, the night snapped taut like a wire stretched to breaking. Just one more step, one more spark, and it would all ignite. Darius stood at the edge of his porch, the cool Texas night pressing against his skin as the unmistakable sound of angry footsteps. Voices and the crunch of gravel grew louder from the street below, and he knew with certainty that the moment he had been preparing for, the inevitable confrontation that had been building through weeks of Linda's arrogance and the HOA's unchecked aggression, was finally here, the siege on his home unfolding in real time as figures moved in the shadows. A crowd forming at the head of his driveway under the pale wash of the streetlights, their faces half hidden but their voices sharp, their anger tangible, and at the center of it all was Linda Markham, her blonde hair catching the glow as she strode forward with the kind of authority only someone consumed by their own entitlement could muster, barking orders at her neighbors like a commander marshaling troops. Her words carrying a venomous edge as she shouted that Darius was a thief, that he had stolen from the neighborhood, that his illegal solar setup was draining power that belonged to the HOA, a lie so bold it almost stunned him into disbelief. But he had expected nothing less. Linda had rewritten the narrative entirely, casting herself as the victim and him as the villain, her voice rising above the others, feeding their outrage until the first few emboldened men began stepping up his driveway, hands carrying bolt cutters, crowbars, and flashlights, the mob swelling with restless energy, and Darius could feel the electric hum of adrenaline coursing through him as he reached down to the panel he had built near the porch rail and flipped the first of the hidden switches, activating the layered defenses he had spent weeks designing. Because this was no ordinary home anymore, his solar fortress was alive, ready to defend itself. And as the crowd surged closer, the floodlights hidden along the eaves exploded to life with blinding brilliance, washing the night in searing white, forcing the mob to shield their eyes, their bravado faltering for a split second as motion-triggered alarms wailed like banshees across the property, sharp mechanical screams echoing through the quiet neighborhood. But Darius didn't flinch, his hands steady as he adjusted voltage controls that sent a crackling surge through the decoy extension cords he had left coiled near the garage, a trap designed to expose anyone who thought they could tamper with his lines. And sure enough, one man rushed forward, yanking at the cable, only to scream and stumble backward as a shock pulsed through him, not enough to kill, but enough to send pain ripping up his arm and drop him to the gravel in a heap. His cries sending ripples of hesitation through the mob, though Linda pushed forward unrelenting, her face twisted in fury as she pointed at Darius standing calmly on his porch, yelling that he was dangerous, that this was proof of his crimes, her hypocrisy so thick it nearly made him laugh. But he didn't have time for amusement because the next wave pressed forward, emboldened by her rage, and he watched as they tried to fan out, moving toward the side yard where the solar array gleamed faintly under the moon. Their intent obvious, to cut, to destroy, to dismantle what he had built, to strip him of the independence he had fought for, and he whispered a curse under his breath as he hit another switch, unleashing the defensive perimeter he had rigged, concealed sprinklers bursting to life not with water, but with a fine mist mixed with a harmless conductive solution that instantly amplified the shocks when intruders touched the wires, turning every metal tool they carried into a live hazard. And chaos erupted as men dropped crowbars that sparked in their hands, screams cutting through the night. Panic spreading, yet still Linda pressed forward, shrieking at them to keep going, her eyes locked on Darius like a predator unwilling to give up her prey. And in that moment, he realized she wasn't driven just by theft or entitlement anymore. She was consumed by the need to break him, to crush him publicly, to make an example out of him, because if she lost here, if he exposed her for what she was, Her reign over the HOA would collapse, her mask of power stripped away, and she would rather burn the neighborhood down than face that humiliation. So she charged forward herself, teeth clenched, stepping over the fallen tools, ignoring the frightened shouts of her neighbors as if nothing in the world could stop her. And Darius's heart pounded as he saw her reach the first step of his porch, her hand tightening around the wooden railing, unaware that it too had been rigged with a defensive current, faint but undeniable, enough to make her body jolt as the voltage coursed through her arm, her scream piercing the night as she staggered. But instead of retreating, instead of admitting defeat, she pushed through the pain, glaring up at him with wild eyes, shouting that he couldn't hide forever, that the board would bury him, her voice ragged but full of venom. And in that instant, as the alarms screamed and the mob fractured into chaos around them, Darius saw headlights cutting through the distant dark, red and blue flashes reflecting off windows, the unmistakable sound of sirens tearing into the neighborhood, law enforcement racing toward the madness. And as Linda stumbled again, her hand still locked on the charged railing, her shrieks blending with the wails of the alarms, Darius knew the siege had reached its peak, the moment of truth crashing down on him in a storm of light, sound, and fury. And he understood that when those sirens reached his driveway, everything would change. The question was whether they would see him as the victim defending his home, or as the criminal Linda had painted him to be. And as she fell to her knees, convulsing from the current, glaring up at him with a hatred so raw it burned, the flashing lights drew closer, bathing the street in an ominous glow, and Darius felt the cliff edge of fate beneath his feet. The war for his home and his freedom balanced on the next breath, the next word, the next judgment that would decide everything. The red and blue lights spilled across the street in a dizzying wash of color as squad cars skidded to a halt at the end of Darius's driveway, the sirens cutting abruptly, but leaving behind a tense ringing silence pierced only by the sound of Linda's ragged screams as she writhed at the base of his porch, her hand still fused in instinctive grip to the railing that pulsed faint voltage through her body until Darius, realizing the optics, reached for the breaker and killed the current, letting her collapse into the dirt, gasping for breath, her blonde hair wild, her eyes glassy with a mix of pain and hatred, while the rest of the HOA mob, shaken by both the shocks and the sudden arrival of law enforcement, scattered like startled birds, some stumbling back into the shadows of the cul-de-sac, others raising their hands as if already anticipating handcuffs. But Linda was different. She pushed herself upright, her voice hoarse but loud, screaming accusations at the officers before they had even fully stepped out of their cruisers, pointing a trembling finger at Darius and shrieking that he had attacked her, that he was a danger to the neighborhood, that he had booby-trapped his house with illegal weapons, her words tumbling out in desperate hysteria, and Darius, standing tall on the porch with the glow of his floodlights behind him, knew this was the moment everything hinged on, because perception was power, and Linda had long mastered the art of bending it. But this time he wasn't just a victim fumbling for words. This time he had come armed with the truth. So as the lead officer, a broad-shouldered sheriff's deputy with tired eyes, raised a hand to demand silence, Darius calmly lifted his phone, tapped the screen, and cast the feed from his security system onto the flat screen he had wheeled to the porch for exactly this contingency, and in crisp detail projected larger than life, the footage unspooled, weeks of recordings, timestamps glowing in the corner as Linda herself, again and again, wheeled her Tesla cable into his driveway under the cloak of night, plugging into his solar grid without hesitation, leaning against her luxury car while stealing his electricity with the ease of someone who believed herself untouchable, the audacity of her theft undeniable, and as the clips rolled one after another, gasps rippled even through the officers, one muttering under his breath in disbelief, while the neighbors who had followed Linda here stared at the screen with wide eyes, the weight of realization crushing the lies they had swallowed. But Linda, cornered, shrieked louder, her voice cracking as she insisted it was fake, that he had doctored the footage, that he was a dangerous engineer capable of fabricating anything. And for a brief moment the air hung thick with uncertainty, until Darius pressed another button and pulled up not just the footage but the energy logs, graphs, data streams, charts, all meticulous, all tied to the very moment Linda had stolen from him. A forensic trail so airtight it could have been presented in federal court. And he explained in a steady, controlled voice how every kilowatt was tracked, how his system recorded the draw, how the timestamps matched the videos, his tone calm and precise like a man presenting to a boardroom. Not defending his life from a mob and the deputies, confronted with evidence that stacked higher than Linda's shrill denials, began to shift, their posture changing as suspicion turned toward her. And still she fought, dragging herself to her feet, screaming that none of this mattered, that she was the HOA president and the law was on her side, that Darius had no right to defy the board, and in that instant the truth of her mania blazed naked for all to see. Her entitlement no longer hidden behind polished smiles and official letters, but exposed in raw, unhinged desperation. And as the deputies moved in, one reaching for her arm, she lashed out, clawing, spitting, raving about how the neighborhood belonged to her, how Darius was a squatter on her land, how she would burn his house down before letting him humiliate her. And the final unraveling came swift and brutal as she fought the officers themselves, her body thrashing, her words devolving into incoherent shrieks. And the crowd that had once rallied to her side now shrank away, their faith in her shattered, their eyes fixed instead on the calm man on the porch who had endured weeks of theft, threats and harassment, yet stood firm with nothing but facts and proof. And as Linda was wrestled to the ground, cuffed and still hurling curses, the lead deputy turned to Darius and asked if he wanted to press charges. And for a moment he simply stared at the broken woman who had tormented him, the embodiment of the arrogance and corruption of an HOA gone mad. And he thought of his wife and children, of the nights he had lain awake wondering how far this would go. And he nodded once firmly, saying yes, he would press every charge the law would allow, and with that, the last illusion of Linda's power dissolved as she was dragged toward the squad car, her threats fading into the distance, leaving behind a neighborhood stunned into silence, the weight of their complicity heavy in the air. But Darius wasn't finished, not yet, because while Linda was the figurehead, he had dug deeper in his preparation, and now he revealed the financial records he had unearthed, documents showing how HOA funds had been siphoned, how fines collected from residents had vanished into shell accounts, how Linda and her allies had enriched themselves under the guise of community service. And as the deputies collected the files, promising a full investigation, whispers spread like fire through the crowd, neighbors realizing they had been fleeced for years, and though shame burned their faces, some turned to Darius with tentative gratitude, murmured apologies, even respect. Because in standing up to Linda, he had not only defended himself, but exposed a system that had preyed on all of them. And as the cruisers pulled away, carrying her into the night, Darius felt the tension that had coiled in his chest for so long finally begin to loosen. Though he knew the battle wasn't entirely over, the investigations would take months. The HOA's structure would have to be dismantled, rebuilt, or abandoned, and Linda's allies might still try to salvage what they could. But the tide had turned irreversibly, and in that moment he had won back not just his power but his dignity, his autonomy, his right to live without fear of midnight theft or bureaucratic tyranny. And as dawn broke over Round Rock, the first rays of sun catching the gleaming panels on his roof, Darius stood barefoot in his driveway, the hum of clean energy flowing steadily through his home. His children waking inside to a future unburdened by Linda's shadow, and though the scars of the battle would linger, he knew he had proven something far greater than ownership of electrons. He had proven that truth. Resilience and preparation could outlast even the most entrenched corruption, and as he turned back toward his door, the neighborhood watching silently, he allowed himself the faintest smile, because while Linda Markham's empire had fallen in flames of her own making, his home stood stronger than ever, shining as a symbol of what no HOA, no Karen, no thief could ever truly take away.